Just a heads up, this podcast talks a lot about dealing with grief. So if you're missing a loved one right now, we see you.
Anyone who's grieved knows that it can leap out of drawers and off the wall and come to you on a perfume or on a snatch of a song, and suddenly you're right back in that space of grief.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman, and this is No Filter, a podcast series all about candid conversations that count. The holiday season is often talked about as the best time of the year. It's a time that's meant to be filled with family and joy and love and celebrations. But not everybody is feeling happy. And when that's you, you can feel incredibly lonely and isolated and like you just don't fit in, as if what you were going through is not hard enough. You also feel kind of out of step with the rest of the world, who seem to be just filled with good cheer. So what about those times that you're not feeling the joy, when in fact you're filled with dread and sadness and maybe despair, and you really can't face the empty chair at the Christmas table or the heaviness in your heart? My guest today knows that feeling all too well, and she's made it her mission in life to help people get through tough times like this. It might be the holidays, it might really be any time of year when you're just feeling bleak. Petrea King is one of the most respected grief counsellors in the country. She's counselled over 120,000 people who are living with cancer and other life-changing illnesses, or they're dealing with grief or loss or trauma or tragedy. She's done it through her incredible foundation, Quest for Life. And personally, she also knows what it's like to be trying to get through the holiday season with a death or a diagnosis or a divorce or some other kind of sadness or tragedy looming over you. She's lost her own brother to suicide, and she's battled her own demons after being given just 3 months to live after being diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia back in 1984. So how can you navigate the holiday season so that you can survive it, so that you can get through what can be an incredibly tough time of year? We wanted to reach out to everyone who is doing a little bit tough and to say that we see you, we understand you, and we support you, and we send you all our love. So we thought that asking Petrea to give us some advice about how to handle things when you're struggling could be really helpful to a lot of people. Here's Petrea King. You talk about all the Ds that can really throw you off, and particularly around Christmas time or any significant time like a birthday. What are some of the Ds that typically make people really struggle with Christmas?
Oh, well, some people have had a year where there have been dramas or disappointments or disasters or divorces, deaths, diagnoses, a daughter sometimes, or a dad. So these are the things that really kind of stop us in our tracks and cause us to consider, how am I going to embrace this challenge? And indeed, I think, we can either be defined by that challenge, and a lot of people remain feeling a victim of that challenge, or we can rise to the occasion, which is not always an easy thing to do, and refuse to be defined by whatever's happened to us, so that we can grow through that challenge, whatever it might be.
Why is it that Christmas and these significant times of year feel so difficult?
I think there's a lot of pressure from society that everyone's meant to be happy and that we're all meant to gather around the table and be pleasant to each other. And oftentimes, if there have been conflicts during the year, or indeed long conflicts or family secrets and all kinds of things that lie hidden under the surface, forcing those people to be around the Christmas table together is often a recipe for a bit of a disaster. And if you add alcohol to that too, that can often compound things. So I think there's this kind of expectation that Christmas is meant to be a warm and happy time with family. And if you're lonesome, it really heightens your isolation. If you're grieving, then you're really in touch with the grief that someone special isn't around the table this year, or indeed year after year. Because often people say the first Christmas is really challenging, but many people find the second Christmas is equally, if not more challenging, because then you've got the whole of your future yawning at you without that person in your life. So I think that expectation is so high at that time of the year with Christmas carols and all the advertising and marketing, and it's a real contrast to the inner reality, the inner landscape for a lot of people.
It can feel that day a little bit like an audit as well, a real taking stock. And if you're not where you thought you'd be in your life,
yes,
you know, you really go, oh, this time last year, there's a lot of sort of comparisons
yes.
to where you were, where you thought you'd be.
Yes.
How best to deal with that?
Well, that's really true. And also I think a lot of people think, I will get that lump checked out before Christmas, or I will get that blood test done, or I will attend to something just before the end of the year. And that, of course, often brings up a diagnosis that you weren't expecting, or you might have been half kind of thinking something needs to be checked out. And then, of course, everyone goes on holiday. So, you know, it's a time where we tend to review the previous year, where we clean up any unfinished business, if we can, from that year. And then, of course, when we bump into the new year, we start considering, what do I want to have be different in this coming year?
Let's talk about some of the firsts for the people who are experiencing firsts. We've had a number of people reach out to say, this is my first year since losing my dad, since losing someone in my life. How do you deal with all that empty seat at the Christmas table? What are some of the ways you can manage that?
I think people can do it in a range of ways. Sometimes it's good to break with the traditions that you've had up until now. So for some people it might be, let's have a picnic in the park this year rather than gather round the table. For others it might be, let's toast Dad, you know, at the beginning of the meal. Sometimes children need to be included in this as well, and they might want to make a Christmas decoration to hang on the tree on Christmas morning, or they may want to have some kind of floral arrangement on the table where that person was. I think the important thing is to not leave that person out of the conversation. You know, it's a real agony if you've lost someone that you love and then no one speaks their name and no one reminisces and tells the stories of their life, because that's a really important part of remembering but also integrating that experience. As you said before, we don't grieve for a period of time and then it's done. In Australia, I think we have this kind of, you get 3 months, you know, and then you're meant to be over it.
Yeah.
And of course, you never get over grief. You become more comfortable with the landscape of your own grief. And, you know, anyone who's grieved knows that it can leap out of drawers and off the wall and come to you on a perfume or on a snatch of a song, and suddenly you're right back in that space of grief. And I think in time we become more familiar with that inner landscape of our own grief. Sometimes too it's been compounded by shock when a death has been very sudden, and frankly even when you know a person's going to die, there's no real preparation for death. It always comes as a shock when it happens. But I think in some circumstances where there's been a lot of shock, whether it's been an accident or a sudden and unexpected death, we secrete very high levels of cortisol at those times. And cortisol embeds memory very deeply in the brain. And it embeds the memory of smells, sounds, touch, so that you've only got to hear a sound and you're right back in there with the grief.
So triggering.
Yes, I remember years ago doing an interview and this gentleman rang up and he was in his 60s. And his sister had drowned when he was 5, she was 3. And he said to this day, the sound of cicadas, the smell of gardenias, the floral print in a woman's frock can have him right back in that same shocked terror of when he found that his sister had drowned. So we know cortisol embeds memory very deeply in the brain. And once you're aware of that, you can be a little more prepared. But I know when my brother took his life, you know, we talked about him and wept about him and laughed about him. But 14 years later, I went to Kathmandu where he took his life, and I was consumed by this very physical part of grief, you know, where it racked my whole body. And I think a lot of people don't understand how physical grief can be. and that it can feel like it's hollowed you out or that you're amputated. It's such a powerful chemical state in your body. And of course that chemical state holds all the stories of the other griefs as well. So when you grieve one person, you grieve all the people, because the chemistry of grief holds all the stories. All of the neurons in the brain that are related to that story are all activated in that chemistry as well. And a lot of people find it quite surprising that when they're grieving one person, that suddenly they're thinking about lots of other people who've died previously.
That's why funerals, even if you don't know that person very well, can be so distressing, and you can find yourself crying and you think, I wasn't even very close to this person. Yes. Where is this coming from? Yeah. But you're saying it's almost muscle memory that you...
Absolutely. And also sometimes we've just suppressed our grief for so long. Perhaps a sister has died and you inherit their children, and suddenly you're very focused on looking after them and you just kind of park your grief. And children are fantastic at parking their grief too, sometimes for decades. But when we park our grief and then suddenly the next door neighbour's dog dies and we can't figure out where does this come from? It was a dog. But that's the release for all of those past griefs as well.
When you're a parent, as you just mentioned, and you've got children, I just interviewed someone recently who had 9 daughters, and her husband was murdered when her youngest daughter was just 5 weeks old. And I said to her, how do you manage so much grief under one roof, let alone your own? And she talked about how they all sort of grieved in different ways.
That's right.
And it was many years down the track, but I've spoken to a lot of people who talk about that compartmentalisation process, particularly if you're responsible for other people.
Exactly, yeah.
How does that work, and how's that best sort of executed?
Well, I think the first thing is to acknowledge that it's okay for young people particularly to park their grief. And it's an agony to watch when it happens, because sometimes they get into all kind of risky behaviours, or they throw themselves into study, or they do something just to do anything to not go near the grief. And if you can talk about it, that's really helpful. Even just to acknowledge. We often use I notice, I imagine, I feel. It's a really useful tool. I notice that you've really thrown yourself into your studies since whoever died. And I imagine that's a way of kind of distracting yourself from the enormity of maybe what you're feeling at the moment, or you're avoiding feeling it by doing that. And I feel it's really important that sometime it needs to come out, and that you might want to write about it, talk about it, scream about it, sing it, dance it, do something to get the energy of that moving at some stage. Because sometimes you park grief for so long that you think, if I start crying, I might never stop, or I might disintegrate into 1,000 pieces and that'll be the end of me. And so we get very skillful at distracting ourselves from the emotional pain. And even when you experience the pain of it, it can still take you completely by surprise at times and be quite overwhelming. I was running a workshop on Saturday about grief. And, I said, look, it's fine to not do Tuesdays. I don't do Tuesdays. I stay in my Ugg boots. I wear my pajamas. I don't answer the door. I don't answer the phone. I sit on the floor. I fondle photographs. I weep my tears. Because if you don't set aside time for grief, then it tends to come out in inappropriate places. You're suddenly in the supermarket and you find yourself reaching for his cereal and then realising he's not here anymore. And then you become overwhelmed with grief, but now you're in the supermarket. And having said that, even when you do make space for grief, it'll still come in unexpected and surprising ways.
When grief and grieving coincides with something like Christmas, or a birthday, how do you manage it? Because particularly if you are a parent and you have children to look after, and you can't just close the door and not do Tuesdays or not do Christmas or not do someone's birthday. What are some of the practical ways that people can manage?
I think the important thing is to not just hope that we get through Christmas. You really need to think about, how am I going to navigate that day in a way that we're all going to survive it? And that might be doing something different. It might be talking to the children and acknowledging the death of their father perhaps, or their mother, and ask them how they might like to acknowledge that on the day. And whether that's making a decoration, whether it's having a cuddle in bed, whether it's whatever it is. Ask the children what's a good way to deal with grief for them on that day. The other thing too that's really helpful for children, and this works from about the age of 3, is to wrap them up in a rainbow every night. And this isn't so much just about grief, it's a great strategy for life. And I took to doing it when my children were 3 and 6, and I thought my husband had gone for a long walk, but he'd gone back to Australia. We were living in America at the time.
Oh, that's a very long walk.
It's a very long walk. He doesn't walk on water either. Then a whole lot of other things happened. I was carrying him. We both fell over in the mud, and we got onto black ice and had a car accident. And I could see this little boy looking at me like, what have I been left with? Where's my daddy? And he started having the most dreadful, blood-curdling, screaming nightmares at night. And so I took to wrapping him up in a rainbow before he went to sleep. And I told him, I'm going to wrap you up in a rainbow, and then we're going to connect up from heart to heart. And you literally run your hand from the top of their head to the tips of their toes and get them to imagine really strongly that you're wrapping them up in a cloud of red, the colour of tomatoes and fire engines and letterboxes. And now I'm wrapping you up in a cloud of orange, the colour of nasturtiums and oranges, yellow, the colour of wattle and sunshine and daffodils. So you go through the 7 colours of the rainbow, and you ask the child as you go, can you see the colour? And kids can always see the colour. And then you put your hand on their heart and get them to imagine really strongly a rainbow that starts in their heart, comes out through the air and connects with your heart. And you tell them this keeps us connected all through the night. I used to do a little prayer with him of, I wrap you in a rainbow of light to care for you all through the night. Your guardian angel watches from above and showers you with her great love. Then he could send a rainbow from his heart back to his father's in Australia, back to his grandparents in Australia. And so now he felt connected to the people that he loved. And he went from 15 nightmares to 2 to none. And he probably wouldn't appreciate me telling you this, but at 39, he's still wears a rainbow ribbon around his ankle. And when it gets all tattered and worn out, I have to hold another one to my heart and fill it with love, and then that goes around his ankle. So we've always stayed connected. We actually have another son who's been in the SAS for 25 years, and he would never be deployed without his rainbow ribbon going with him. So the rainbow is a very powerful visual image of connection.
Yeah.
And I know the son who's in the SAS would say, I love knowing I'm at the end of you guys' rainbows when he's overseas. So I think we all love to feel that we're deeply connected to people, and children need to know that they can continue loving someone who's no longer physically present. And indeed, we need to know we can continue loving someone who's no longer physically present in our life. And, whether you're into quantum physics or into some spiritual view of life, love never dies. And these people are as much around us as they ever were. We just can't hold them and sniff them and hug them and do all of the things that we love to do in relationship.
If they don't have you or a parent to wrap them in a rainbow, can we wrap ourselves in a rainbow? We can
certainly wrap ourselves in a rainbow.
And make that heart-to-heart connection.
Yeah, just imagine that you're under one end of the rainbow and breathe in all those iridescent colours and let them be a balm to your own heart. And then, it's always useful too when you're hurting to do something for someone else. That's another thing I think a lot of people do at Christmas is rather than do whatever they've done traditionally around the table, that they volunteer and that they go serve lunch to somebody else, or that you can send a rainbow. I know when I had leukemia many years ago and I couldn't even be bothered meditating for myself, I would offer that meditation up for someone else, another young mum who was dying, so that she might feel the balm of calmness that I so lacked at that time myself. So I think that's a great boon to us, is to send some kind of blessing to somebody else.
You mentioned when you had leukemia, you were given in 1983 just 3 months to live. We've talked about grieving for other people. What about the D of diagnosis that you mentioned, and the people who are living with that, maybe living with cancer, maybe looking at their children, maybe wondering if this is going to be their last Christmas.
The last Christmas, exactly, yeah.
How do you even begin to cope with that?
Yeah, look, it's not easy, and it makes it all the more poignant. And I guess the best part of nearly dying and then not is that you realise how incredibly precious life is, how dear we are to one another, what a treasure we are to one another. And, I've known many mums who've been in that circumstance since. And one many years ago, she was a carpenter and she made her daughter a doll's house. Her daughter was about 3. And she secreted into this doll's house little scrolls of paper with poetry and with some of her favourite foods and colours. And she hid them all in this doll's house, and she said it would take her daughter years to find all of the little things that she'd secreted away into this beautiful doll's house. And, that takes so much courage. It takes the courage of acknowledgement that if I'm to die, then what's the legacy I want to leave? And indeed, I'd encourage any parent, don't wait for a D to be a living demonstration to your children of how to conduct life, because it's, a bit hair-raising. There's unexpected, unthinkable, unimaginable things happen all the time. And so we want to be a living demonstration to our children of how to maintain your own inner calm in the midst of crisis, in the midst of the unexpected, the unthinkable, the unimaginable, when it does happen, so that we can respond skillfully, not react as a helpless victim. And that takes skill and dedication, and it's often when we hit one of the D's in life that we get to that place where we say, that's it, something has to change, and it's me. I can't change the D. I can't change what happened to me. I can change who I'm going to be in relation to that. Am I going to be defined by that, or can I be more than that? And it's interesting that people often say, it's second nature for me to think like this, feel like this, react like this. And no one ever questions, what's your first nature? What was there before you took on the anxieties, the limitations, the fears, the habitual ways that you do things? Because people will say, it's second nature for me to blame other people for my unhappiness. It's second nature for me to withdraw into an old familiar pattern of I do it myself. It's second nature for me to isolate, to drink too much, drug too much, eat too much, eat not enough, sleep all the time, not sleep. So it's second nature to us to do all of these things, and it's usually a D that causes us to question, who do I want to be now in relationship to this thing? Mm-hmm. And then we can make that return journey back home to our essential nature. And that's where wisdom and insight and intuition and spontaneity, humour, creativity, compassion, all of those qualities reside in the present moment. And yet our brain is so often projecting our fears, worries, concerns, all the things that might happen, could happen and probably won't happen, or we're going into regretting and blaming and shaming and feeling bitter about the past. The brain is actually designed to be focused in the present moment, because when the brain is focused in the present moment, then you have access to insight, intuition, wisdom, humour, spontaneity, creativity, compassion, all of those really useful qualities that we all need when we're living lives that are full on and busy and full of the unexpected as well.
What are some of the transformations that you've seen in the course of your work when people are faced
I think
trauma?
So many, I've had conversations with over 120,000 people now. So I think, to me, what's so marvellous is the capacity of the human spirit to not be defined by whatever's happened to them. That we all have this capacity, and we often need a lot of love and support and education in how to not be defined by the dramas and the traumas that might have happened. But, you know, people come to our programs constantly who refuse to be defined. And, you know, we hear stories all the time of murder and mayhem and violence and the unexpected things that happen, diagnoses, death, disaster, that happen in people's lives. And yet they travel not only from all over Australia, but now from outside of Australia to find a safe place where they can utter the unutterable and have it acknowledged and heard, because none of us will shift until we feel like people get us. And once you feel like this person gets why I'm feeling, acting, behaving the way I am, once you feel not judged, once you feel accepted just as you are, then people are open to finding a way through to a larger version of themselves. But if you're always trying to pull a person out of the pain that they're in, the anguish or the despair that they're in, if you're always trying to pull them away from that, you're actually saying that you're not acceptable as you are in that. And once you really deeply accept someone exactly where they are, then up comes this amazing capacity to find a way through.
So I suppose human nature is designed to make us want to cheer each other up. It's going to be okay. You're strong. You're a fighter. It'll be fine. I know it will. And does that somehow undercut and not give someone the space to say, I'm scared,
yes.
I'm anguished,
Yeah.
I'm bleak?
Yeah, exactly. So I think we need to meet people where they are and walk with them from that place, rather than say, you'll be so much better when you're over here, where I'll feel better because you're not so angry, not so despairing, not so overwhelmed, not so depressed, not so suicidal, not so whatever it is. And if we can actually meet a person where they are and allow them to perhaps utter the unutterable, because everyone doesn't want to hear that pain, they don't want to hear that anguish. I remember a young mum who was, you know, only in her early 30s, and she had 2 little girls, and, you know, all of her friends were incredibly supportive when she first had cancer. And then when she had secondaries, you know, a few of them drifted away because it's like, I'm not sure we can keep doing this. And she represents their worst nightmare, of course. Mm. And then she was quite doubled up, but she loved to go to the school to pick up the girls after school. That was the one thing that she would rest the whole day so she could be there. But now she was quite bent over on a walking stick, and more of the mothers stayed away because they didn't know what to say, they didn't know what to do. And then her husband was killed in an accident.
Oh my God.
And everyone disappeared, you know. And at that time I lived on one side of the harbour. She lived a long way south on the other side, and she drove that long distance and sat in my office and just said, you know, how can I have given birth to these children and now leave them? And I had that same question myself. So there is nothing to say. You know, people will say, oh, it's God's will, or that's why my favourite bumper sticker is, my karma just ran over your dogma, because so often people are trying to make sense of suffering, and sense is never the appropriate response. Compassion is the appropriate response. Unless that woman feels safe enough to utter those words, knowing that they can hang in the space without someone trying to fix them or change them or make them any better, but just to bear witness to that is a blessing to her, because it's no longer a private inner anguish. At least she's been able to find the words to utter it. And if we can capture it in words, then we can get the energy of that terrible, lonesome place moving. And of course, for me, it confronts us with our helplessness and our powerlessness to change what's happening to someone that we care about. And that's an agony also. But we can meet each other in that place. And that's a great blessing in itself, because not everything can be fixed or changed or made better. And it's hard to find good companions when you're in that dark place.
I want to ask you another question, but first of all, I want to see what happened to those girls.
They were raised by their grandparents, yeah.
I have a friend whose had a close friend who was dying, and she said she didn't know what to do, and he was in the hospital, and the advice she was given is just pay witness. Just go and just be there. You don't have to make it better, cheer him up. Just show up.
Yeah.
Because there's something that, you know, and I've heard people who've suffered tragedy or who are going through a terrible time, and they say people will cross the road to avoid them because what is it? We're afraid because it's too confronting.
Well, we're afraid we might say the wrong thing, that we might make it worse.
That's what we tell ourselves, but obviously you can't make it worse.
Exactly.
And is it just that we're too scared?
Well, a lot of us are a bit afraid of our own emotions.
Yeah.
And we have this thing about, you know, we mustn't cry. You know, having a good weep sometimes in each other's arms is a very healing and beautiful thing, to be united in that space of grief rather than everyone putting on a stiff upper lip. You know, we always say it's hard to kiss someone who's keeping a stiff upper lip. You know? And, you know, to meet each other in those places. And, you know, a lot of the rituals and the ways that we, you know, we're not terribly good at any of these messy emotions. There was a time when a body laid in the room for 3, 4, 5 days, and that's still possible today. Most people don't know that it is, but you can keep a person at home for, you know, 5 days, and there are cold plates that you can get so that everything stays okay. And people are kind of caught up just in the system of, oh, I've got to ring someone, and then before you know it, this whole machine is taken over. And off goes your loved one, and you might have wanted to spend some time. There might be people coming from a long distance who need to sit with that person. I know when my brother died, my father made the executive decision, really, that my brother wouldn't be brought back to Australia. And I think in some ways that was really hard because there was no body, there was no funeral, there was no memorial, there was no packing up of possessions. It was just a phone call, and you know, it was very hard to deal with the reality of that when it was just a phone call. One moment he was in Kathmandu and then he just wasn't. And to this day, I can still see a head in the crowd or someone on television and think, oh, you know, I wonder if it was him. And intellectually, of course I know that it was him who took his life. But there's something about seeing a body and being with that person that can help you to come to terms with the reality of what's happened. And I know my father was only trying to protect us from seeing Brendan in the state that he was, but it was still quite challenging to not ever have that kind of resolution.
Some people would worry that will then be the only memory I'll have of them, and it will colour all my memories. Is that your experience?
Happen? Well, that can certainly happen too, and that's back to that cortisol, that when you see someone and they don't look how they usually do, or especially if they've perhaps taken their own life or been in an accident or something, or even if you've sat by the bedside of someone who has gone through all of those physical changes and that memory is very embedded in your body because of the cortisol, it can be quite challenging. There are techniques and ways of releasing that so that people are not so caught up with just those final days and can reconnect with the lifetime of memories and the lifetime of pictures that they also have in their memory, but they can be quite obliterated by those last images of a person if it comes as a very big shock, which is why it's always useful to warn children, you know, if you're going into a hospital to see someone who's close to death, to explain ahead of time, you know, they're probably going to have a mask on their face and that's helping them to breathe, and, you know, their hands might be feeling cold or whatever it might be, so that you prepare the child in some way for what they're about to experience. And even then it can still come as a shock. You know? There are some things that are very difficult to prepare for. And as I said, even when you know someone's likely to die of a disease after many years, when it actually happens, it still comes as a great shock. So I think in lots of ways, you know, when we love someone, our energies are enmeshed in each other. And when that person dies, we know who we are through our relationships, because we bump up against each other, and that's where we discover who we are. And when you lose that, a lot of people lose that sense of identity. Who am I if I'm not in this relationship? What's my value as a person? What does it say about all of the memories that only that person and I shared? And so that can really heighten that deep sense of being alone at that time.
I follow two women that I admire on Instagram and social media, and both have lost their partners in the last 12 months, both to pancreatic cancer, actually. Elizabeth Gilbert lost her wife after about 2 years, and there's another woman I follow called Rebecca Wolfe who lost her husband within about 6 weeks of his diagnosis, and they had 4 young children. And between the time he was diagnosed and the time he died, she talked about how everyone says put your own oxygen mask on first. And
Yes.
particularly if you have to take care of children, put your own oxygen mask on first. But she said sometimes you need someone to put it on for you because you instinctively will just give everything you have to the children that you have to take care of. And you need someone to say, no, I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to...
Yeah.
How can we support people who are going through grief? What are the best ways we can support them?
Well, it's not enough just to say, let me know if there's anything I can do, because they won't. They don't even know what would be useful for you to do. So just mow the lawn, do the shopping, take the dog for a walk, pick up the kids after school, do something, bake. Well, a lot of people's freezers are full of baked food. But think about, what could I do that would actually be practical? Pick that person up, go for a walk in the park, do something. Don't just leave it as, you will let me know if there's something I can do, because they haven't a clue.
You got to put their
time.
Oxygen mask on for them. Don't wait for them to ask for it. There's an app, actually, I think it's called Can Do, that is being created, I think, by the Cancer Council, and it's for anyone, whether they have cancer or they're going through any sort of grief or a hardship, and it basically allows you very easily to combine with a group of people and do whatever's required, meals, errands, picking up kids. It's all through this one app. So that kind of practical support.
Really helpful. And maybe there's one person who can be the go-to person, so that not everybody is ringing the person who's grieving, whose world's been completely turned upside down. But maybe there's a friend that can do the phone tree and organise calling other people and organise food or organise mowing or gardening or whatever needs to be done. So, it does take a community to raise a child, and we need to act as a community when there's grief. Bundanoon has been selected as one of the compassionate communities, and we're looking at, it's already a compassionate community, but if
what
it were
does
to
that
be
mean?
A compassionate community is to have that heightened awareness of the people who live alone, who may be frail, who may need transport, who may be heading towards death and are alone, and what could we do as a community to heighten the awareness so that people are not so isolated in their grief or in illness. Because, there's a huge demographic of single older women where, these people can slip through the cracks very easily in a community, whether that's a city or even in a small town like Bundanoon is. So we need to be mindful of the fact that people are dealing with all kinds of enormities that we may not know. It's why we always say to people, do you feel as good as you look? Rather than you look well, which often means, please don't tell me how you feel. I've already
That's a
decided.
great thing to say. Do you feel as good as you look?
Because it means that I get you and that there could be a completely different story going on for you beyond appearances. And if we only say, oh, you look well, it often means, please don't tell me how you feel.
Yeah, because it's really closed, isn't it? You look great.
Yeah.
It doesn't really give anyone the space to say, well, I'm actually not doing so well.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
And we do that a lot to each other.
Yes.
And or we say, I'm fine. And we say fine stands for freaked out, insecure, neurotic and emotional.
Yes, especially at Christmas.
Exactly.
And also just most of the time.
Yeah, so we need to... I think we're losing our compassion in some ways. You know, from our politicians down, we don't see respect, let alone compassion, for one another. And I think it's the mark of a society is the compassion that it extends to the minorities and to people with disabilities and people who are alone and people who may be grieving and lonesome. And, you know, if we want a really strong resilient community, then we need to have it based on compassion and community so that we do reach out to one another in times of difficulty.
I've heard you say you aren't your body, but you also aren't your mind.
Yeah, well, you're not your brain, you have a brain, and it's meant to be in service to you, not running the show. If your brain's unmanaged, it's all over the shop, and it's always projecting stories into the future or into the past. So I was very, very fortunate to find meditation when I was 17. So it makes 50 years this year that I've been meditating. And, you know, that helps you to keep your brain focused in the present moment, where you have access to those really useful qualities that I mentioned before. And the thing is, the moment you start fretting, worrying, projecting stories into the future or regretting, blaming, shaming about things in the past, you lose your creative ability to embrace whatever's going on in the present because you're not really there. And we know that 95% of the time people are acting out of their subconscious, their unconscious. And we're just reacting over and over again to the situation that we're in. A response takes you into new territory. And we don't say to people, take reactability for your life. We say, take responsibility, your ability to respond to the life that you're having. And so a reaction's always in the body. You know, when you're reacting to someone or something, it's in the stomach, our breathing changes, our heart rate changes, we might feel our head's going to burst, we might get sweaty palms, our jaw might tense up, our neck, our shoulders. So we'll have a favourite reactivation place in our body. And if you were to ask yourself, how old do I feel right now when you're in the midst of a reaction, we're always a little kid.
My therapist used to say that to me sometimes. How old do you feel right now?
Yeah.
Not very old.
So we're literally reactivating the physiology of the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old and living it again in the present moment. A response takes you into new territory. So one of the things that you need to become aware of if you want peace of mind is, where do I react in my body so that I notice the moment that that starts up? Because I don't want to speak from that. I don't want to act from that, because I'll be bringing the 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old to the environment rather than an adult. And an adult allows you to respond moment by moment to whatever's going on in your life. And of course, our reactions are also held in our language. When we're reacting, we say words like, I can't, instead of, I choose to, or I choose not to. I will, I won't, I've decided to, I've decided not to, but not I can't. You know, I can't speak in public is speaking out of that reaction.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't want to turn this into a
workshop.
workshop.
But even I don't is like better, because it's like there's an aspect of choice in I don't.
Yeah, because there are no shoulds either. You know, it's not that you should speak in public. It might be entirely appropriate to say, thank you so much for asking me. I choose not to speak in public.
Petrea, just to finish up on Christmas, I often have found on significant days, and I've heard this said a lot, the lead up is often worse than the actual day itself.
Yes.
How do you manage that lead up, and then when does it get better?
Well, I think it's useful for all of us to know what are our alarm bells for when we're at the end of our tether. So it's one of the things we do on our programs is get people into little groups and look at what are the activities, the things that I do or how I behave when I'm at the end of my tether. And they're always the same. You know, I drink too much, I drug too much, I isolate, I blame others, I get headaches, I get whatever it might be.
Spend too much time on social media.
Yes, exactly.
Reach for my phone.
Yes. So if you write down what are your half dozen favourite ways of manifesting stress, and put them up on your bathroom mirror so that you can cruise down that list on a regular basis and make sure none of those behaviours are happening. They need to be your alarm bells. And then also, we also get people to reflect on, well, what are the activities, the environments, the things that you do or you have in your life where you feel a deep sense of connection to yourself. And they're things like listening to music, being in nature, bushwalking, having a massage, yoga, meditation, ritual, prayer. When you look at all of those things, they're all present time activities, hobbies, craft, horse riding, whatever it is. They're all things that bring us into the present moment because that's where we love to be. And so if you write down your half dozen favourite ways of replenishing yourself physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, socially, and you have that list up on your bathroom mirror. Now, there are 168 hours in the week. We checked it out internationally. Everybody gets 168. And you need to divvy up those 168 hours so that you do those things that replenish you first. That's your oxygen mask. So they're non-negotiable. So if it's meditation, if it's yoga, if it's massage, if it's soaking in a hot tub, if it's lighting a candle, if it's going for a walk, whatever it is, you need to do that on a daily basis, not when you're at the end of your tether. If you do those things on a daily basis, you're very likely to never go to being at the end of your tether because you fill up your own inner bucket every day. So if you know that you're coming up to a stressful time, as Christmas is, then that's a good time to redouble your efforts on, do I need to go to the gym? Do I need to go to the beach? Do I need to swim? Do I need to light candles? Do I need to schedule massages? What do I need to do in the lead up to Christmas so that I navigate that day as well as possible? I know for a lot of people too, when they're grieving, they actually experience the symptoms that their partner or their loved one experienced in their body. So, for instance, there was a woman who, her husband had a cerebral hemorrhage, had a car accident. He didn't die until several days later. But on the 13th of every month, she'd get this blinding migraine. Oh. And it took her some time, and it had put her in bed for a week. It took her some time to realise that he'd actually had the accident on the 13th. And once she knew that, then, so he didn't die on that day, but she manifested the same headache on that day every month. And once she recognised it, she was able to, in the week leading up to that, to listen to some of the music they both loved, to go on the bushwalk that they both loved, to soak in a bath 3 nights a week, to have a massage. And so scheduling in, being more conscious of knowing that I'm coming up to that day, and then scheduling in some things that you know really replenish you deeply will help you to more consciously navigate that, rather than just hope that we get through the day. Hope has to have legs. It has to be underpinned by effort so that we more consciously embrace these difficult days and not just leave them to chance.
I love that, and especially for women who are so depleted by Christmas, because it generally falls upon women to organise the food, buy the presents, bring the cheer, smooth over the cracks of any little family outbursts. And so even a woman who's not grieving will be feeling depleted by Christmas. So I think
she doesn't have to, though.
Well, there's something that we can all learn from that idea of really trying to replenish ourselves.
That's the benefit of the Ds, because when you hit a D in your life and you decide that's it, something has to change, and it's me, I am going to divvy up my 168 hours so that I more consciously take good care of my physical, mental, emotional and spiritual well-being, and you do that on a daily basis. Frankly, you've got oodles of energy. People sometimes say, it sounds a bit selfish, focusing on yourself. I'll tell you what's selfish. Up until I was 33, I was constantly preoccupied in my brain of how am I going to get it right for this person, and what do I need to do to get it right for that person, and how do I fix up this situation. And that's selfishness, because you're totally self-absorbed in your own thinking. Once you know that you're not your body, but you do have one, and you need to nourish it, rest it and exercise it. You're not your brain, but you do have one. You need to quieten it down and keep it in good company. You're not your feelings, but you do have them, and you need to be able to witness yourself having the feelings or express them in ways that don't wound yourself or anyone else. then you get to anchor your sense of self in something that's beyond change. Because your body will always change, your brain is always changing, your feelings are always changing. But the peace that passes all understanding is to anchor your sense of self in that which is beyond change. And that's the consciousness that you arrived here on the planet with and that will leave when you're gone. And if you anchor your sense of self in that place and take responsibility, good care for your physical, mental, emotional and spiritual well-being, then you're home and host.
Well, out of the 168 hours I have this week, I think this hour that I've spent talking to you has been the one I've used best. So, Petrea, thank you so much. I'd love to have you back and talk more. Thanks for listening to No Filter. If you want to find out more about what Petrea does, she's such an incredible woman, please visit questforlife.com. The Quest for Life Foundation provides intensive educational support programs and community-based workshops that encourage and educate and empower people with the tools to create emotional resilience and peace of mind. Assisting people from all walks of life, the Quest for Life Foundation provides a proven, effective and holistic approach to physical, mental, emotional and spiritual well-being. And if you're struggling, please know that you're not alone. Please call Lifeline on 13 11 14 if you need to talk to someone. Please know that you're not alone and we're thinking of you at this really difficult time. No Filter is produced by Liza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman and I'll see you on mamamia.com.au.